we live and move and have our story. In love, God lives in us and makes us whole. Oh, Jesus, may we hear the word that calls us near. Your story makes a home within our soul. Your story makes a home within our soul.
Welcome to StoryFest. Quite a few years ago, I was teaching broadcasting and drama at a university in the Philippines. And as a drama project, one of the students asked if he could produce a play that he had written. It was based on the Bible story of the prodigal son. It's one of the most well-known of the many parables that Jesus told. Well, when I saw his work acted out by the other students in the class, I frankly didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I guess I did a bit of both. His play had a minute or so of the son going out to the far country, and then about 20 minutes of wild music and partying and erotic dancing and drinking, and finally a minute or so about the homecoming. Well, let me tell you, we're going to get inside the story of the prodigal in this video, but the emphasis may be just a tiny bit different than it was for my student. It's a very short story, but there are so many ideas, themes, and characters in it that we can connect with all of them and through them understand more clearly who we are and how we relate to each other and to God. Now there's a book I've read at least a half dozen times. It's by Henri Nouwen, and it's called The Return of the Prodigal. It's the most perceptive study of that parable that I have ever encountered. It's based on Rembrandt's famous painting, The Return of the Prodigal. Nouwen challenges us to identify with all three of the characters in the story, with the young son who runs off, and the jealous and angry older son, and with the father. I realized that I had been both the irresponsible youngest son and the jealous older son, but it was hardest for me to identify with the father. Sadly, all the characters in the story are male. That's the way it is with most biblical stories because, well, they arose in a sexist culture. But in this story, the characters could as easily have been women. And Rembrandt may have thought about that too. The shadowy face deep in the dark background, could that be the mother? So that's the adventure we'll offer in this StoryFest video, the famous story of the prodigal son. Let's begin as we listen to Alice and Rennie tell the story as it comes to us in the Bible.
Then Jesus said to them, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger son came to him and said, 'Father, give me the share of property that will belong to me.' And so he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant land. And while he was there, he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine covered that whole land, and he began to be in need. He hired himself out to a citizen of that place who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs, and he gladly would have filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "My father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, and here I am dying of hunger." Then he said, I will return to my father, and I will say, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, I am no longer worthy to be called your son." And so he got up and began to travel home. When he was still far off, the father saw him and ran to him and embraced him and kissed him. And then he said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to the slaves, "Go and get a robe, the best one, and put it on him. And get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And go and get the fatted calf, and kill it. We must celebrate, for this son of mine that was dead is alive, was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. Now, the elder son, returning from the fields, approached the house and could hear music and dancing. And he asked one of the slaves, "What's going on?" The slave said to him, "Your brother has come back, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he's back safe and sound." Then he was angry, and he would not go into the house. The father came out to him and began to plead with him. And he said, "Father, I have worked like a slave for you all these years. I have never disobeyed one of your commands. Yet you have never even given me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. And yet this son who comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, for him you killed the fatted calf." Then the father said, "Son, you are always with me, and what's mine is yours. But we have to rejoice and celebrate because this brother of yours that was dead is alive. Who was lost is found."
We call it the story of the prodigal son, but the word prodigal isn't in the Bible. And I realized I wasn't even sure what the word meant, so I checked the dictionary. It means someone who is extravagant, over the top. Well, that could apply to all three of the characters in the story. In many ways, the story is far more about the father who goes all out with his love, more about the father than it is about the two sons. Artist Don McNair, I think, felt that way too. In his study of the prodigal son, he offered a very poignant drawing. It shows us the eyes of the prodigal father, and that really got to me because, well, I am too the father of a prodigal son.
Nowlan's commentary on the prodigal son brought to my attention the idea that the encounter between the old man and the wastrel presents the viewer with the decision of whether you too can join in the Father's rejoicing, that he's not merely forgiving the boy, he's overflowing with joy and with mindless generosity. And so I've included in this picture two other people, perhaps the older son and the mother, who are also onlookers to the man hugging the boy, and their attitude to the man's forgiveness is more perplexed or more complex.
The story Allison told us from the Bible is a parable. A parable is a story that's made up to help us understand, and Jesus did a pile of them. But there's also lots of other parables in the Bible, and one of the most famous ones is the humorous parable of Jonah, which we tell on another of these StoryFests. Jesus told a bunch of parables, and they're always rich and juicy. Here's Donald Schmidt to help us understand how powerful and painful and hilarious the story of the prodigals can be for us.
I belong to a group. There are a lot of members in this group. Many of them tend to be younger than me. We're an interesting group of people. We are the folks who have never seen the movie Ben-Hur, but we know that one of the chariot drivers is wearing a wristwatch. In fact, the only part of Ben-Hur I've ever seen is that one brief moment where you get to see the chariot rider's wristwatch. It's those little pieces of stories that fascinate me. I couldn't give two hoots about the story of Ben-Hur, but I'm fascinated by the wristwatch just because it's there. Maybe it's because I'm a youngest sibling, I don't know. But anyway, in my book, Bible Wanderings, I played with a number of Bible stories, taking as my starting point a little tiny piece in a story and wondering what would happen if we took that tiny piece. And that's an interesting thing to do with parables, with any of Jesus' parables, because there's always at least one, sometimes more, tiny pieces in there that are absolutely vital to the story. And we often miss them. Either we miss them because somebody told us that the story means something else, and we believed them. That was back in those Sunday school days. Whatever. Or we miss them because we live in a different culture and several thousand years later, and so it's really hard sometimes to relate to certain things. So in this story of the prodigal, there are a couple of pieces, little pieces that we must not miss. One of them is why Jesus is telling the story. At the beginning of the chapter in Luke, it's pointed out that some Pharisees were upset that Jesus was spending all of his time with tax collectors and sinners, which was just the generic word for all of those people we don't like because they come from the other side of the tracks. And in response to the Pharisees, Jesus tells this story. And knowing that it's in response to them, really the key piece in the story is not the child coming home, although for me that's the key piece in the story. It's really about the reaction of the other sibling. But over time, that's taken on far less meaning for us than the other piece in the story. The other one, though, is there's something unique to parables. Every parable Jesus told does this. It's part of the story technique of a parable. They always have something outrageously funny in them. That's the nature of a parable. And thus, you start to tell the story, and everybody sits there waiting for the outrageously funny part. We miss it in this parable because we don't live in the same culture. We don't live in a culture where men, especially wealthy men, wear several layers of long robes. They would do that in those days. If you were wealthy, you wore long robes, often that would traipse along the ground. You could not work in such robes, and thus wearing them was a way of saying to people, I'm just a little more important than you are, and so I have lots of heavy long robes. I can't do manual labor. The other thing that you cannot do with long robes on is run. And that's an important part of this story. Because we're told that the father, when he spies the son way down the road, runs to him. And the only way you can do that is to hike up your robes to your waist, which is the equivalent in this story of running down Bernard Street here in your underwear. It is a funny part of the story. It's meant to be a funny part so that your interest peaks up.
I've often mentioned in these StoryFest videos that one of the best ways to get inside a story is to tell another story. It helps to put it into a modern setting too, because, well, then we can feel the punch and the power of it. And Donald Schmidt has written 2 such stories. The first is the story of the prodigal father and son, and the second is about a prodigal mother and 2 daughters.
I do some of my best thinking when I'm shaving. It's a quiet, peaceful time.
Pardon me?
Work with me, Ralph. Work with me.
Okay.
It's been a long day with him, hasn't it?
Once more from the top.
I do some of my best thinking when I'm shaving. It's a quiet, peaceful time, and I'm all alone, and I kind of like that. The bathroom mirror affords a wonderful reflection through the top of the window, and I can see the road stretching off into infinity. Ah, that road. Sometimes I'll see a car or 2 driving by, maybe an early morning bird checking out last night's roadkill. If I'm running late, I notice the local kids heading out to the school bus. I think of the times I've traveled down that road, a short jaunt to town or the beginning of a journey to places far and beyond. And of course, I think of coming down that road in the other direction, tired in the evening and glad to be coming home. It's down that road that my son left. So many times I'd watched him and his brother walking with their friends headed for school, or maybe riding their bikes, laughing and claiming ownership of the whole world. But one day my son went down that road and didn't come back.
Dad, I was wondering if, you said that everything you owned would go to my brother and me when you and Mum died. Well, I was just, thinking that, my brother likes the farm and he seems bent on sticking around here, so why don't you give him the farm? I mean, I don't want it. Then you could give me that money that you have saved in the bank, and we'd call it a deal. What do you say, Dad?
He paused for a short second, but before I had a chance to say anything...
maybe I could have it now. What do you think?
Did it matter what I thought? We both knew what I would do. We both knew what he would do. Why argue with fate? The day I handed him the cashier's check, we knew what was next, although we both clung just briefly to a little bit of denial.
I think I'll spend a little bit of this, do some traveling, but I'll save the rest for college. I'm just going to take a few months to find myself, and then I'll go back to school in the fall.
He left the next morning without saying goodbye. We heard from him once, a postcard in January from Florida, but that was it. 3 years went by. We wondered and worried. Each story of a hurricane, a riot, a bitter cold snap, unemployment, drug wars, they all made us look at each other a little more fearfully and wonder. But we didn't talk about him. It seemed that words might somehow seal his uncertain fate. The farm continued, and we continued, but we ached. Oh, how we ached. Each morning while I was shaving, I would notice that road, and I thought at one point of even boarding up the window so I wouldn't have to look. I tried drawing the shades a few times, but it felt wrong somehow. I needed to wonder. And after a while, it got a little easier to look down that road, but the pain never went away. Where was he? One March morning, as a particularly cold winter was fighting to hang on against the inevitability of spring, I saw the road in the mirror. I stood as usual in my underwear and lathered up my face. I looked down as I rinsed the razor, and when I looked up, I saw a distant figure on the road. I couldn't identify it, but I didn't need to. I knew who it was. I dropped the razor, I dabbed at the cream on my face, and I ran out of the bathroom. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, I leapt out the door and ran up the road. He stopped as soon as I got closer, as if he didn't know what I was going to do. I held him, not caring if I crushed his bones, so long as I could feel his heart.
Dad, I'm so sorry.
I didn't want to hear it. I only wanted to savor this moment, this homecoming, this holding. It was too good to cloud it with words. After a long, long hug and heaving tears, I stood back and focused on him. He looked awful. Not an ounce of meat on his bones, and that gaunt, pained, sickly look on his face from too many drugs and too much fear. But he was alive, and he was home. Let's get you inside. Your mother's got some coffee on.
She was always the one. Maybe because she was born first, I don't know. But she was their favorite. I knew my parents would always care for me, but somehow it felt like they liked her a little bit more.
You know, you try to love your kids the same, even though from the outset they're as different as night and day. Emily had a clear head on her shoulders. Marta somehow, was it flighty or always wanting reassurance, never seeming satisfied when they came?
When Marta left, I did care. I really did, but I also hoped that things would lighten up a little for me, that my parents would be a little softer on me. It happened a little, but they seemed so preoccupied, worrying about her. Then one day, after Marta had been gone for a while, my mom got a phone call.
I knew the call would come, I just didn't know when. I wasn't prepared when it did. "We have your daughter. Quick, is she dead or alive? And we think you'd better come down. She was picked up for soliciting." Was I allowed to feel relieved? Was I allowed to feel glad that she'd been found? Was I allowed to feel all the anger and the frustration of 3 years that we had not heard from her?
Everything changed. Suddenly it was all about her again. And I just slid back where I belonged.
We got in the car and we drove through the dark. It was late. It took 2 hours. That strange mix of adrenaline, pain, anger, fear, joy, and love, they all propelled us down the road. What would I say to her? What would she say to me?
One day I got a medal at school for doing super well on a science project, and I came home pumped to share it. The house was quiet. They weren't home.
It was far more awkward than I had imagined. There were no words. She looked like a walking cliche, painted, drugged, eyes hollow and empty. My daughter. Our hug was uncomfortable, forced. She seemed too scared to let herself go into my arms, and I was businesslike, strangely appropriate. My questions were buried under an avalanche of silence. I couldn't ask them, not yet. Maybe never. I wanted to know, and I didn't want to know. I was probably as scared as she was. They kept her. There was this fog of technicalities about jurisdiction and stuff that I couldn't understand. The drive home was endless.
I texted her to ask, "Where are you?"
We were allowed to visit her twice a week, and so we did. Drove 2 hours there, 2 hours back, for 1 hour in a room full of a bunch of nervous people. All the way there, we'd convince ourselves it was better than nothing, and on the way home, we didn't talk. But it got easier over time. She began to look a little bit better, and each week her smile dared to come back a little more. We found we could joke about a few things. We still didn't ask all the questions we wanted, but they somehow got answered little by little. One night, we got home late, and I went into the kitchen to make myself a sandwich. Our daughter Emily was just coming in from an evening out.
Mom came into the kitchen.
"How was your day?"
"Fine."
"Just fine?"
"Fine. I'm just fine." As if you care.
What do you mean? Of course I care.
Yeah, right. You're never here.
I knew I had to stay calm. I knew I couldn't yell, even though I had had weeks of tension and anger, and at who I don't really know, at the universe, at God, at myself. Emily didn't deserve it all.
You spend all your time visiting that slut.
Hey, don't talk like that.
It's
But yeah,
totally
Emily
not
was
fair.
angry.
It's totally not fair.
I know. She's your sister, and I love her. Suddenly the air in the kitchen was heavy. And I love you too. For the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of watching you become a woman. I've gone to your basketball games and I've cheered like an idiot. I drove you to school when you missed the bus. I watched the fashion show when you bought all those clothes with your first paycheck. I've been worried when you stayed out late and relieved when you came in knowing you were safe and you'd just been out laughing with your friends. All of this, Emily, and I've loved every minute of it. But I never knew where your sister was. I imagined the worst. I had to love her from a distance, not knowing if she was dead or alive.
I was glad my sister was alive. And I wanted to kill her. And I wanted to hug her and cry with her. And I wanted to hug my mom too, but I couldn't. Not yet.
So the question is, which are you in this story? Which of the three characters do you identify with? In my case, I've been both the younger child and the hyper-responsible older child, even though I was the youngest in my family. And now, in my senior years, I'm trying hard to be the father, the prodigal father. It can be very hard. Alison Rennie didn't find it that easy either. She shares her experiences with us.
For me personally, the first point of connection with the story is actually with the frustration of that older brother. I was the younger child, but I was the youngest girl. And so I had responsibilities at home, and I think I identified more with the frustration of that older brother, like doing all the right things all the time. My brother got to have a fast car and be bad. But somehow I didn't feel I was allowed, those things. So the first point of contact is with that older brother. But when over time and years of engaging this story, I've dropped, I think, away from that older brother, although, obviously it's still there. That brother. The moment in the story I connect with is the moment when the younger son, in the scripture it says, he came to himself. And I connect with moments in my own life where it's like I wake up out of some sort of fog I've been living that I thought was my life, and I suddenly can see myself more clearly or truly. Those moments, when I was really young, coming out to myself as a gay person, was that one of those moments. I was like, oh, now I see, coming to myself. Moments of being able to see myself through my work and see that I was really a workaholic. And all my good things I was doing actually were not truly coming from that core of self and spirit. I woke up to see myself clearly. These kind of concrete moments in life where I've come to myself, awakened.
This might be a good time to stop the video and to ask yourself how you fit into the prodigal story. And if you're fortunate enough to be watching this with a group of friends, it would be a good time to talk with each other about your experiences. But please remember that we don't push or probe. We let people share whatever they want to share, and it's okay to not say a thing. And when you're good and ready, you can start the video again.
Sing with me.
How deep the peace, the confidence of those whose wrongs are forgiven. How deep the peace, the confidence of those whose hearts are healed. How deep the peace, the confidence of those whose wrongs are forgiven. How deep the peace, the confidence of those whose hearts are healed.
I was married for 17 years to a fellow who, after 17 years, we divorced. And as divorces go, people struggle and aren't always very nice to each other. And we not only become separated from the individual, but also from the whole family. And we miss that whole family, and sometimes that's never reconciled. Through the years, I've worked hard to try to keep my own heart soft, and I had a really good friend say to me one time, when I probably said something nasty, "That's not who you are," and called me back to being who I am. And through the years, I was able to stay connected to that family and to be reconciled with that family. And recently, my first husband died, fairly recently actually, and my sister-in-law turned to me on the day that we disconnected his life support. I was there when that happened with my kids. And she, later in the day, she said, "Well, would you do his service?" And I said, "I don't know if I could." And went home and thought about it. And although I didn't do his whole service, I did the eulogy. And Linnea, thank you for those words in that song. Because so definitely, that sense of confidence when you know you've been forgiven, and that confidence of when you have that sense of that hardness of heart being healed. And as I look at this image and I see my brother-in-law, an Orthodox priest, when I finished the eulogy and was talking with him afterwards, and as he embraced me and would not let go, that family is mine forever.
I think when we're younger, and I was the eldest of 4 boys, I probably reacted to this story the same way as a lot of people would. And been, why is this guy getting this? But I think now, and I would probably imagine it's a lot of you are in the same boat. I think we get a little older, we get a little more forgiving, and maybe we have got our way set in life and we're okay. It's probably easier to forgive. But I find the painting or the etchings that you've presented here are amazing. Mm-hmm. I look at this one right now and I look at the Father's eyes. Look at his eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That Father.
You have been behind those eyes, and so have I.
Yeah. It's Father has been reborn. I see forgiveness. I see the Father so wrapped up, I can't be envious of what the Son did. Just a beautiful, beautiful painting. Thanks.
It's no wonder the prodigal story is so well known. It's very often misunderstood. It's often trivialized, the way that student did in the Philippines. He thought it was about a guy who runs off, has a wonderful time blowing the family savings, and then gets welcomed home with open arms, no sweat. Well, as we've seen, it's about so much more. And by all means, keep on talking to each other for as long as you need to. And since this is a video, you can go back and watch some or all of the program again. Those 2 stories that Donald wrote about the prodigal sons and the daughters and parents, if you'd like copies of those 2, just go to the Woodlake Productions website and you can download them. They're free. And while you're there, why not check out this book, The Gift of Story, which offers many ideas about storytelling and how that works in our lives. I had great fun writing the book, and I think you'll have fun reading it. And here is another resource you might want to check out. The title is kind of long and awkward. Is This Your Idea of a Good Time, God? Well, but in that book, I take a bunch of stories from the Bible and I retell them in a way that may help you shine a bit of light onto some of the corners of your soul. Like all my books, I try and make it a fun read. But back to the story of the prodigal. It seems evident that when Jesus told this story, he intended us to see the Father in the story as a way of thinking about God, a prodigal God who forgives us and loves us far more than any of us deserve. God welcomes us home. God wants us to come to the party to enjoy and celebrate a love that's there for everyone. For everyone. The story of the prodigal son is really about a prodigal God.
Your story makes a home within our soul. Your story makes a